This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm.
And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett, and joining me as ever is my co-host Clara Kirk. How are you, Clara?
I'm good.
You're not feeling too burnt out today?
I'm pretty burnt out, to be honest, but it's because, my id has been running around all night.
Okay.
Destroying things and threatening people. My unconscious mind.
It'll make you contemplate a change of career. You could end up, being a sex slave trader. Who knows what kind of career you might
hope not, but yeah.
Apparently that's what people go to when their first choice of career doesn't work out. We are talking today, listeners, about, as you can hopefully guess, since this is not something that comes up repeatedly in Star Trek, we're going right back to the beginning. We're looking at the original pilot episode of Star Trek The Cage. And I thought we'd do this partly because we've got Discovery Season 2 coming around the corner. And obviously Discovery was always sort of in this interesting place where they were pitched sort of midway between Star Trek's kind of full start and its real start, midway between the kind of original unaired pilot, The Cage, and the original series. And of course, with season 2 of Discovery, we have Captain Pike and Pike's Enterprise and Pike's Number 1 and so on, all coming into the story and sort of coming back to Star Trek in a big way. Obviously, we did see Pike in the Kelvin universe as well, so he is a character who's kind of has kept coming back over the years, even though he was never, other than in the Menagerie, was never, his sort of version of Star Trek wasn't what we got first time round, in a sense. So I thought it'd be a good time for us to kind of go back and take a look at The Cage. And we're looking at it particularly with reference to a very significant influence, I think, certainly on that episode, but also in some ways on Star Trek as a whole, which is the film Forbidden Planet. And for anyone who's not familiar with it, this was a film made in 1956, about 10 years before Star Trek debuted. It's a real kind of science fiction classic. And it shares a lot of similarities, really, particularly with The Cage, as I say, both in terms of kind of themes and also in terms of style. And you can certainly see that it's a film that must have been there sort of in the background in people's imaginations as Gene Roddenberry and his team were kind of working on this, brand new venture, this new TV show that they were putting together. The influences, I think, are very clear there. Yeah,
so from what I read, Gene Roddenberry was supposedly inspired by Forbidden Planet, and Warren Stevens, who plays the Doctor in the film, also guest starred in the original series episode by Any Other Name, which is also an episode about sort of aliens that are, I would say, non-humanoid in nature, although they take humanoid form. And also, apparently, the serial number of the Enterprise, 1701, is the time on the clock of the flying saucer when it enters the orbit around the Altair 4, which is the first planet, the only planet that they land on, Forbidden Planet.
The Forbidden Planet. Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that is interesting about Forbidden Planet, I think, is for a sci-fi film, it does take place largely on the planet. I mean, there are a few scenes kind of on the ship, but the ship lands, is this kind of flying saucer ship, and it lands on the planet, the Forbidden Planet, as it turns out to be. And then most of the action takes place on the planet itself. There's very little kind of space action, which actually, interestingly, you could say is true of the Cage. I mean, really, you know, the Cage kind of starts in space and ends in space, but the majority of the story takes place on the planet. And obviously that's something that Star Trek, you know, you could say the same of many Star Trek stories. Although I sort of think it's interesting how much of the Cage takes place down on that planet, in these kind of fantasy scenarios. You know, really the main story is absolutely the captain's story, down there, and the rest of the crew and what they're getting up to. You know, we do see a little bit of what's going on the ship, but given that, you know, in some ways we think of Star Trek, we think of the Enterprise, we think of, I mean, aside from Spock, the Enterprise is the one thing that made it out of that sort of pilot in one piece. It's kind of interesting they chose to do that. And that's another element that I think these two stories kind of have in common, aside from the fact that, you know, the Cage is about a forbidden planet as well. Maybe not at the beginning, but as we find out in the menagerie, you know, after the events of the Cage, even going there is punishable by death. So you've got these kind of two forbidden planets. You've got Altair 4 and Talos 4, and there are definitely some kind of real similarities between them. Although it's interesting, you know, you were talking about whether Gene Roddenberry was influenced by Forbidden Planet. He actually denied this when people asked him about it later. I was looking into it, and apparently there's a quote here from the Captain's Logs books, these kind of books full of, you know, interviews with people who worked on Star Trek and so on. And a reporter apparently in the 1970s asked Roddenberry whether he'd been influenced by Forbidden Planet. And he said, definitely not. The only time I ever thought of Forbidden Planet specifically was when I was laying Star Trek out, and I said to myself there were some mistakes they made in the film I didn't want to repeat. Now, this is quite a bold statement, given that this is like a science fiction classic. It's, you know, most people regard it as quite a sort of groundbreaking film. And the only thing that Roddenberry was willing to talk about in that instance was that he didn't like the fact that there's this cook character who is a bit of an idiot and is kind of dressed in an apron and he didn't like the fact, he said, that he was scrubbing pots and pans with his bare hands rather than using some kind of sci-fi device to do that. I can't help thinking this was a bit disingenuous, because actually if you go back, there are other records. There are like memos, for example. Roddenberry wrote a memo in 1964 to Herb Solow, which says, "You may recall we saw MGM's Forbidden Planet with Oscar Katz some weeks ago." And then he goes on and he says, basically, in terms of the design of the Enterprise, which they were working on at the time, he's hoping they could get another chance to go and see the film again, maybe take some, find some way of sort of copying some of the, not copying it as in they're going to use the same imagery, but kind of for their own reference, that basically it was clearly an inspiration. He says a detailed look at it again would do much to stimulate our own thinking. So there was a conscious decision there to say, okay, this film is going to be a bit of a touchstone. It's going to kind of be useful to us coming up with Star Trek, even if we don't necessarily go down the same routes. This is something that we're definitely going to be kind of referencing. And then he says, "I'd appreciate it if you could provide me with a credit list for the picture, specifically the director, art director, special effects men, etc." Presumably the only reason he'd be asking that is he's wondering whether he could hire any of them. So, you know, there's definitely, I think, a sense, on the one hand, this was a big influence on certainly on the Cage, and then also there was this desire later on to kind of try and downplay that and claim that wasn't the case.
Yeah, I wonder why he felt the need to do that. I can only imagine that in the 70s, perhaps maybe Forbidden Planet had fallen out of favour at some point, or maybe it seemed rather hokey and old-fashioned for some of the science fiction that was being created in the 70s. I think it's a strange thing to do. I don't actually believe him when he says that he wasn't influenced by Forbidden Planet, partly because of the evidence that you've provided, but also because there's just so many similarities between the plots, and there's so many similarities in terms of like the use of electronic instruments, the use of different electronic sound effects. The ship in Forbidden Planet was actually a prop that was used repeatedly in the Twilight Zone. And this like made me think of something that I've always kind of thought was actually possible, which is that a lot of science fiction shows borrowed different parts of their production or stories or themes from each other. And I sort of feel that, I mean, well, definitely there's a lot of parallels between Forbidden Planet and also The Cage. There's some really obvious parallels in the sense that, like you said, the two captains are the main characters. It's very much the action takes place on the planet. But there's also this idea about mirages and appearances and things not being what they appear. almost like a kind of Wizard of Oz kind of theme, like what's behind the curtain, who's the magician who's making everybody see something that all these mirages that aren't actually true or aren't real, these creatures manipulating your thoughts, and you're seeing things from dreams and all that kind of thing. I mean, a lot of this is born out of the fact that Forbidden Planet is basically a retelling of Shakespeare's The Tempest. I mean, it's pretty much the same story. And so obviously like Mobius, or is it Mobius? I think it's Mobius. The main character who is sort of like...
Or Morbius. Is he Mobius or Morbius? I think it might be Morbius.
Morbius. He's Prospero, basically. And so he's the sort of magician stroke sorcerer who's on the island, except this time it's a planet. And there's also that idea of psychology being part of the story. So in The Cage, there's a lot of psychological manipulation of Pike, and in the film there's a lot of discussion about psychology, about the ego and the id, the conscious and the unconscious. So, and that's something that I think is actually quite unusual in science fiction, and maybe not so much now, but probably in science fiction like in the 50s. So it's less about aliens attacking people and people firing their ray guns, and much more about the psychology of exploring the galaxy, but also the psychology of your own worst nightmare, your demons, your monsters within the human mind. And those two pieces of sci-fi have the same sort of common theme. So I thought that was really interesting. There's also the main female character in both the film and in the episode is practically the same. Altair and Vina, right? They're practically the same character, except that Vina obviously in the end turns out to be a disfigured survivor of a crash. But like they almost have very similar relationships with the main male character.
Completely. And I mean, they're also, they're both playing very much into this sort of science fiction trope. I don't know if you're familiar with this trope of the born sexy yesterday trope, which is a way of describing these female characters, which happen quite a lot in science fiction, where you have a character who is sort of innocent and naive, and yet kind of basically sort of sexually available, and sexually kind of the film or the show or whatever presents them in a very sexual light. And at the same time, you've got this idea that they're very sort of innocent and naive. They've never met a man before, which is the case, with the woman in Forbidden Planet, because she's grown up. She's presumably 19 years old. She's been her parents crashed on the planet on their ship 19 years ago, and then her mother died and her father's brought her up. Very much a similar sort of situation to Prospero and Miranda in The Tempest, as you said. And so she has this kind of naivety in her dealings with the men of the ship who land, all of whom are kind of lusting over her in quite a sleazy way, I'd say. It kind of makes the original series look sort of restrained in a way, the level of kind of leching that's going on from the men in this film over her, but she's very innocent. So for example, there's going swimming naked, for example, and the captain says, she says, come and join me in the pool, and he says, I didn't bring my bathing suit, and she says, what's a bathing suit? And he looks not exactly appalled, but kind of embarrassed and kind of shocked and so on. So there's this kind of comic, but also slightly kind of sleazy element going through it. And of course that trope, the idea of the born sexy yesterday trope, Tony and I talked about this way back when we were looking at Star Trek. Shakespeare influencing Star Trek and Shakespeare together is a trope that you could say goes all the way back to The Tempest and to the character Miranda, who, she has this line, the love interest for her is, and I'm going to paraphrase it, she says something like, the second man I ever saw, basically other than her father, the first that e'er I sighed for, with a kind of double meaning on the idea of sighing. So there's this idea of this sort of sudden sexual awakening to these men arriving, and that you definitely get that in Forbidden Planet, and you get it again in The Cage, where it's all about Vina trying to kind of, that Pike is her ideal man, and they say that at a certain point, that they've actually selected Pike because he's her idealized man, in a sense. So it's not just that she's like some kind of duckling who imprints on the first man that she sees exactly. It's more like he does fulfill exactly what she wants. At the same time, there's a weird twist, I think, in that version, that she's actually not, strictly speaking, born sexy yesterday. She's faking it, because we find out that actually she does sort of know what's going on. Admittedly, it's not her scheme, it's the Talosian scheme, but she is kind of aware of what it is. And shock horror, we find out at the end of the episode, she's not actually 18 years old or whatever she's supposed to be based on when the ship crashed. She's actually, they discover she was an adult. So, the kind of shocking reveal at the end of the episode is we see that she's been disfigured in this crash, but she's also much older than she's been kind of purporting to be. So there's this weird kind of twist on the trope there, I think, in The Cage, where this character turns out to kind of not be what they seemed at all. And she's an interesting character, I think, in that you're right. She presents as exactly the same sort of stock characters we see in Forbidden Planet. I feel quite sympathetic to her in a way, because you get that whole thing where with she's sort of being tortured and she talks about her headaches and so on. She's been kind of totally sort of dragged along with this Talosian scheme in a sense. But then by the very end, she seems to be resisting a little bit more. So I don't know. I think she's an interesting character, but certainly the way that she's presented falls very much into these quite kind of sexist tropes and this quite kind of cliched idea about femininity in Hollywood. And say in Forbidden Planet, I mean, she's literally the only female character in the film, and it is kind of laughable how, that sort of old Hollywood kind of presentation of femininity that you get there somehow when she was surrounded by all these men.
Yeah, I think that this is definitely an example of 50s and 60s sexism. And I felt it a lot, actually, from both pieces of work. But, I mean, I'm looking at it from a 21st point of view as somebody who is a 21st century woman. So I try really hard with the original series, Star Trek original series, to try not to judge it too much from a more modern point of view, because I know at the time Gene Roddenberry was trying to do something very different, and he was, like, for instance, in Forbidden Planet, all the characters are white men, and although The Cage has a lot of white men in it, it does have two women who are seen on the bridge. It does have Spock, who I think is Gene Roddenberry's attempt to actually put something different in there in the crew. And obviously we know after The Cage, in the original series, as the series went on, we did end up with different ethnic backgrounds, perhaps not as many as we could have. And, we've talked about this in the podcast before, there's no representation of anybody who's a member of the LGBT community or anything, although obviously back in the 60s being gay was illegal. So, I mean, there's lots of things that they could do better, but the original series really did try to instigate, I would say, more ideas about equality, challenging perhaps maybe prejudices and discrimination as much as it could. So I try not to judge the original series too much, but I was quite struck by Pike's reference to the fact that, I mean, well, there's several things that are really funny, isn't there? So Pike's reference to the fact that he's not used to having a woman on the bridge, and then sort of number one kind of looks at him like, what? And then he sort of says something like, oh, I didn't mean you. Whatever he said was, I don't think of you as a woman. And then his sort of barking at his yeoman, and her being like, well, you wanted this report at this time, and I'm here at this time to give you this report. Like, well, what's your problem? And then the sort of person that he's suddenly drawn to is this supposedly very innocent, like you said, born yesterday sexual character who really shapes herself to his desires. It's a little bit like that later on in The Next Generation, that female character that sort of shapes herself to men's desires and ends up sort of like imprinting on Picard and that kind of thing. And
right, yeah.
And there's obviously this hilarious moment in The Cage where the women get beamed to the planet and all the men get left on the transporter pad, and Spock sort of rushes forward and throws his arms open and screams, "The women, the women!" I mean, I totally had forgotten that it was in the episode, and I spent a good portion of, I would say, almost a whole minute laughing to myself. But I think I really struggle with the idea that the main male character is given the choice of 3 women in which to choose from. And, one of them is a subordinate, so young but pretty, but she's under his command. And the other one is somebody who I suppose is maybe intellectually his equal, although not necessarily in the command chain as equal, but she's intelligent and obviously competent at her job, but he doesn't see her as a woman because she's in the force or whatever. And then the other one is this sort of fake character that's been presented to him as like everything he could desire. And yeah, it all feels a little bit sexist, really.
And she explicitly says to him she can be whatever woman he desires. So she can be the, you know, nice wifey having the picnic and very sort of down-homey, you know, and we sort of set up, I mean, that conversation that I alluded to earlier where he talks about kind of wanting to quit his job and leave Starfleet and kind of get rid of all the pressure and the stress and so on. He is quite burnt out at the start of this episode, and so the options he talks about are kind of, you know, on the one hand kind of settling down in this kind of rural sort of retirement almost, it sounds like, a bit like we see with, you know, Captain Kirk in the Nexus in Generations. And the other is he makes this reference, which I suppose maybe I'm being a bit unfair because it's slightly unclear whether it's a serious suggestion that he's going to become an Orion slave trader or if it's kind of just a flippant remark to the Doctor, who's obviously his friend, and they're having a drink and so on. But at the same time, it's obviously in his unconscious because it's something that Vina pulls out. You know, the Talosians pull out both of those references. So first of all, they present this sort of idyllic scene where they're having a picnic together, and he's even got his old horse there that he presumably remembers from, you know, his Starfleet days or whatever. And then when that doesn't work, they try the kind of Orion slave girl scene. You get this extremely extended dancing scene where she's the kind of exotic dancer.
Yeah, that one. So she does forever.
Literally. I know, it just goes on and on and on, doesn't it? And the music cue, it's like the music gets to a point where you think, okay, that's the end, and then it all kicks up again, and you sort of think, wow, you know, this is okay. They obviously wanted to like get their money's worth with that day's filming or whatever. But I mean, so she is literally not just like she can mold herself to be what he wants, but she can literally be completely different people. And actually, it takes him a few seconds the first time she does that to recognise that it's the same person that he's already met, and he says, you know, your hair's different, but it's you, isn't it? You know, you're that woman from the planet, sort of thing. So there is that sense that, yeah, she can kind of be anyone. And I mean, I suppose the other two female characters, there are two other women, which there certainly aren't in Forbidden Planet, but they're quite sort of, you could say they're quite kind of cliched. I mean, I think number one is an interesting character and I think it'll be interesting to see where they go with her in Discovery, because she's a character that, you know, partly I think because it was Majel Barrett playing the role, partly because she is a very sort of strong character. She's quite a kind of iconic character. She's someone that people have been intrigued by over the years. You know, she crops up in the novels. People have kind of wanted to find out, sort of write more backstory for her to kind of learn a bit more about her, because we find out so little about her, I suppose, in The Cage. At the same time, she is another kind of cliche. She's this kind of cool, sort of frigid career woman. Do you know what I mean? That they have that conversation where he says, oh, basically, I don't think of you as a woman. What he means is that she's seen as sort of, you know, sexless and unfeminine and kind of, you know, he is almost like, it does feel a bit like he's like some, I don't know, guy in his office or whatever who's got his secretary, and he's got his, you know, and then there's a woman who's been promoted or something, and he's not sure how to do I deal with her as a man or as a woman or whatever. It feels very much of its time, I suppose.
But you see, the main problem with this situation is that the women have to be defined. And I think that isn't something you find with the men. Yes, the Doctor is a particular type of role. Yes, the Commander is a particular type of role. I guess Spock is different, but they're not defined in the same way. Like, we're not asking whether or not Spock is a sexual creature. You know, we're not asking about whether or not the Doctor is attractive. The Doctor isn't trying to fit into a particular role. I guess he's kind of a sort of grumpy Western type Doctor character, but do you see what I'm saying? Like, as in, we're asking the women to fit into defined roles. They're either totally not women because they don't seem sexy enough, so they can't be women, or they seem, you know, they're involved in the bridge or bridge crew, or they're working in Starfleet, so they're not really women, or they are the ideal fantasy for a man. So I think that's probably one of the main issues with both the films, I would say, in terms of its representation of women, is it's putting, the women have very defined roles. They have to be one or the other. They have to be this or that. Whereas we don't demand that of the male characters, or the filmmakers didn't do that with the male characters. There is, you know, there's a man who's comedic. There's a man who dies. There's a man who's a doctor. There's a man who's a commander. There's a man who's, I don't know, some sort of mysterious alien or whatever. But they're all still taken seriously as Starfleet officers or as characters. Do you see what I'm saying? So, and they don't have to change in order to be accepted or validated or to fit in with the story. I just wonder how different The Cage would have been if they were asking the captain to change. I mean, I guess they do to a certain extent. They ask him to behave differently, But if they were asking him to change his very being, like his very, like, who he is as a person, as what they asked Vina to do, I think the end of the cage really bothered me. So Vina's shame about her physical appearance. It was really sad that she, was dying after the crash and that her body was put back together by the aliens, and the aliens didn't know how to put a human being back together because they'd never seen a human being. But is her shame that she's disfigured? And is that why she stays with the aliens? I sort of felt like she stays with the aliens because she can't live as a disfigured person, in the human world. And as we know, the Federation, especially later episodes of the original series, sort of implies that sort of thing shouldn't matter. And the fact that the captain doesn't stop her, he's like, yeah, she's better off here with her sort of like fake beauty. That really bothered me.
It's interesting, isn't it? She gets. I was watching it. What it made me think of, though, is that, I hear what you're saying. It's interesting, and it's interesting. They had that scene where Pike comes back to the Enterprise and he says she explained her reasons, and I agreed with them, basically, or something like. He sort of says he completely gets it once he sees that. I suppose it's slightly unclear. Is it just about a kind of visual thing, or she does sort of say, they put me back together in the wrong way or whatever, and everything works just about. But like, we don't know whether it's painful for her or difficult or whatever, because obviously then what we have in the menagerie is we have Pike going back, but he's not just been disfigured, he's literally, he can't communicate, he can literally only say yes or no because he's in that kind of box thing. And in a way you can sort of understand he gets the same outcome that she did, interestingly, and they even kind of, the final line of the Talosian is the same, only in the menagerie it's to Kirk rather than to Pike, where the Talosian says, she has her illusion and you have your reality. And what do they say? Something, it remains to be seen which of you will be the happier, or something like that, whatever the line is that's the kind of idea. And so it's interesting that basically, ultimately, Pike in the kind of Star Trek story gets put in that Vina role, in a sense, where he's going to accept the illusions. And for him, it's the illusion of himself being kind of back to his kind of physical prime or whatever. It reminded me a bit of what Vina gets, that she sort of gets her Pike after all, even if it's the fake one, of what they did in Doctor Who with the Billie Piper's character, that they had this kind of romantic tension for a long time, and then she kind of got to live happily ever after with the Doctor, but it wasn't the Doctor who carried on going. Do you know what I mean? She sort of got her version of the Doctor, so she kind of got a happy ending, and the story could kind of move on in a sense. There's something of that sort of feeling about it. I think it's an interesting one. But one of the things that I think is interesting about both these stories, and that plays into the kind of these sort of gender issues that we're talking about in the cage, is this idea of forbidden desire. And the idea of the forbidden planet, and both these planets, as I say, are forbidden planets. And for Pike, a lot of it is this kind of sort of digging into his unconscious. What we get in Forbidden Planet is that this is a spoiler for anyone who hasn't gone to see, hasn't seen Forbidden Planet. But basically what it turns out is there's this monster that's attacking the people on the planet. And it turns out that the monster is a monster from the id, as they say. It's basically the kind of unconscious sort of nasty emotions, this kind of unconscious rage of the kind of Prospero character, of this kind of brilliant genius guy who has there's also this sort of one of the big themes that the two stories share is this idea of kind of elevating your brain power. I mean, he's literally been put through this kind of machine that the previous aliens whose planet it was had built, that magnifies your kind of brain strength or whatever. The Talosians, we're told, have brains 3 times the size of humans. So there's this kind of idea of the kind of dangers of that. And what's happened in Forbidden Planet is that they've done this, but they haven't realised that it's going to magnify their unconscious as well. And their unconscious is dangerous and murderous and deadly. But in Forbidden Planet, the danger of the unconscious is all about kind of, rage and violence. It's basically a kind of violent monster. In the cage, the unconscious is all about sexuality. It's all about libido. And of course, you could say this is Gene Roddenberry's spin on, what's the kind of danger of man's unconscious. Suddenly it's not all about the kind of rage and stuff, although we do see that because that's what Pike uses to kind of effectively sort of blind the Talosians. He realises that they can't cope with strong, primitive, as they call them, emotions. So this idea, again, with this idea of sort of primitive or unconscious emotions and so on. But at the same time, what we keep getting is this idea, and it's interesting, you talked about shame, about Venus shame. There's also this idea of, are Pike's fantasies shameful? The fact that he does seem to have this fantasy about being this slave trader or whatever, because that's what gets acted out. There's definitely an element of kind of shame attached to that. And it is his kind of desires and so on, which are not acceptable. In his work, he doesn't see number one as a woman. He says the yeoman, maybe there's a kind of attraction there, but he's not going to act on it because, as you say, she's a subordinate. So it's quite a sort of transgressive situation that they get thrown into suddenly, where these, these three Starfleet characters who have very professional relationships with each other and have kind of boundaries put up between them. Suddenly they're put in this quite awkward situation where they're being told they're going to, two out of them are going to populate this planet with humans and so on. And then there's that kind of slightly embarrassed moment at the end. And it's interesting that, the episode basically ends. Talking about this kind of slightly sleazy element running through Forbidden Planet. It ends with the Doctor saying, because they've been talking about Adam and Eve, saying Eve as in Adam, and the captain says, as in all ships' doctors are dirty old men. You can't help thinking, having watched this, and maybe, quite a lot of like TV writers and TV producers are as well. But that's kind of the joke at the end of the episode, basically, is this kind of, oh, you dirty old man or whatever. But it is interesting, I think, watching these two stories, in combination with each other, how much of that it all becomes about kind of Pike's desires and Pike's kind of fantasies and so on to some extent. And it's not really, although we see him, he has been burnt out, he has been kind of traumatized by this mission where he lost people, he's got all this kind of dark stuff going on. It's not really there that we focus in on. It seems to be much more about the kind of sexual stuff going on and the kind of how does he feel about these three women, as you say, that he's kind of being forced to choose between one way or another.
Yeah, I think that we're supposed to think that the aliens, what are their names again? The Viridians?
The Talosians. Yeah, there's just too many aliens in Star Trek. I can't remember all of them. The Talosians. Well, you can't hold that against the Cage, though. There was only one at that point. Surely. They didn't even say what Spock was meant to be. I don't think, did they?
The Talosians.
Some random guy with pointy ears.
Pin a pitchfork. The Talosians are supposed to be unable to understand like lust and sexual desire, right? Because their brains are so big. Their brains are so big that they, I'm just laughing because it's such a funny idea. Their brains are so big that their mental power is so great that they basically have pretty much brought down their own civilization, which is exactly what's happened with the ancient civilization in Forbidden Planet, whose name I cannot remember either.
The Krell.
Thank you. Isn't there a great line at the end of the Forbidden Planet where one of the characters says to another character, like, what made you think you're so arrogant? What made you think you could, hold the power of the Krell in your mind or something? And I actually burst out into hysterics with that as well. There is a running joke in my family about the Forbidden Planet, because I went to see Forbidden Planet at the BFI when I was very young with my parents. That's the British Film Institute for anyone in the US. And the whole idea of the ego and the id and this crazy id going around and like murdering people really, for some reason, tickled my mother. She thought it was absolutely hilarious. So for many years in my family, there's been a joke about the murderous id. I don't know why. It was funny, and I don't know why she felt like she could joke about it with a child. But anyway, so I always find Forbidden Planet a little bit amusing, as well as kind of a fun film to watch. But yeah, there's this idea that the mental power of these aliens is so great that they've actually kind of forgotten how to sort of exist. Does that make sense? Their big brains and their intelligence and their intellect is too much, and it's basically brought down their civilization. So knowledge is a good thing, but it's like too much knowledge leads to less feeling and less gut instincts and sort of getting further and further away from morality. And I think that actually is something that is a theme that sort of runs through the entirety of the original series, actually. This idea of like intellect gone mad, intelligence that's so superior that whoever is possessing that intelligence has kind of forgotten how to be human, or forgotten how to be empathic. Or there's this great theme in terms of like Kirk, Spock and McCoy, which is that they sort of balance each other out. I mean, Kirk has, the I would say like the real soul of the three of them, and McCoy has the heart, and Spock has the brain. So there's intellect there, but there's also a lot of feeling as well, a lot of like gut instincts and emotion, and with that, I suppose as well, like sexual desire. I mean, Kirk is going around like basically making out with almost every woman he meets on a planet, anywhere. So the Cage does set the tone very well for what's going to follow in the rest of the original series, I think. It's interesting that both the film and Star Trek emphasize how important being intelligent is, but it's like the dangers of being too intelligent.
And you get that again with, I went back and watched as a sort of point of comparison Where No Man Has Gone Before, because obviously, the Cage is an unusual example of a pilot that didn't make it in a sense, but it was good enough that they got to have another go. And so in some ways it's you get the sort of the two versions of Star Trek in a sense. If the Cage had succeeded more, I guess we'd never have got William Shatner. Maybe we'd have got however many seasons of Star Trek with Jeffrey Hunter, and it would have been a very different story. But you're right, that kind of idea of kind of overreaching or of kind of trying to increase your own abilities, your own mental powers or whatever. Yeah, absolutely, is something that kind of goes right through Star Trek. It is actually, of course, also the theme of Where No Man Has Gone Before. So, they put aside this one story that didn't quite land, and they come up with another one, and it's got this same theme actually. And in that instance, it's all, and again, it's this idea of like what gets dragged up with it when you're doing this. You've got this character of Gary Mitchell who's becoming, as he keeps saying, he's becoming like a god, he's becoming super powerful or whatever. But the danger is that he's bringing with him all his kind of petty human, this kind of nasty side of human nature, in a sense, that is always kind of there. And you get it as well in the original series in, say, The Enemy Within, where it's actually putting a slightly different spin on it, saying, well, we need that side of us, that sort of primitive side. But always this idea that, we're going into the future, we're going into space. There's this kind of interest in the kind of cerebral, thoughtful, intelligent side. What I guess, if you think of Next Gen and the kind of whole Roddenberry's whole conception of Next Gen as these sort of evolved human beings and so on. But the original series is much more concerned also with this kind of earthier side and this kind of, slightly less palatable side of human nature, in a sense, that has to go along with that. And you're right, in the Talosians, you see these people who they've tried to put everything into their enormous brains, and yet they've kind of destroyed their society in the process because they've lost the ability to do anything. They've become so kind of, it's funny, there was this criticism, the Cage was so cerebral. I can't help wondering whether partly, well, I have to say, first of all, watching Forbidden Planet and then watching The Cage, you think, wow, this Cage was not that cerebral. Certainly the first half of it, there's fist fights, there's lots of romance, there's lots of kind of action, compared to Forbidden Planet, which I think is genuinely quite a slow paced, very kind of languidly paced film. Not much happens throughout most of it. Actually, The Cage has got quite a lot of action in there, but maybe it's a bit sort of front loaded and then it becomes a bit sort of philosophical. But it's also got this theme, which is about being too cerebral. And I can't help wondering whether that was partly what people were feeling when they were watching it, was that it seems to be all about this species who have, got too clever for their own good somehow. Whereas when you get to Where No Man Has Gone Before, it's almost the opposite. You've got this kind of petulant, angry, super powerful being who's kind of not being evolved and not being sort of superior like that. And in Forbidden Planet, you kind of got both, because, what happened to the Krell was what they wanted was to sort of transcend physical existence. I think they devised these enormous machines and so on. They were into kind of enhancing their brain power, their kind of mental abilities and so on. But what they forgot was that they had this other side that they'd sort of been suppressing. It's a bit like what you see with the Vulcans, I suppose, with, the Vulcan kind of suppression of emotion and so on, that there's this, what Freud would call the return of the repressed, which is, the sort of same idea as the monsters from the id. It's this stuff that you're kind of, that is going to come back and bite you in a sense. And so that's what happened to them, was their society was destroyed by their kind of, primitive unconscious that they had kind of not factored into the equation. So one way or another, you always have this kind of idea about these societies that when anyone tries to kind of improve themselves, it's a bit like, again, it's a bit of a sci-fi trope, the mad scientist who tries to, uses invention on himself, and instead of making him perfect, it turns him into a monster of some kind. It's kind of that sort of story in a sense, but on a societal level. But definitely you've got this kind of repeatedly this theme of, people trying to make themselves brainier or more evolved or whatever, it backfires because they forget that there's another side to their personality that's going to kind of get enhanced along with it.
Yeah, I mean, what I thought was quite interesting is at the end of Forbidden Planet, the main character, who's played by Leslie Nielsen, I think we should mention that he's played by Leslie Nielsen.
I know, absolutely, yeah.
Who is playing a character that you wouldn't associate Leslie Nielsen with. You would associate Leslie Nielsen with the Naked Gun films and like a comedic role. And actually he's playing quite a serious character in Forbidden Planet. He does a really good job. I think he does a really good job. He sort of says something like, we should, after all, we're not supposed to play God, or we're not supposed to be God. And it's that idea that what led to the downfall of the Krell civilization is like basically the crime of hubris. Like they reached too far and they reached too big and it led to their extinction. And yeah, like the dark primitive side of man has to be acknowledged and has to be tried to be reined in, really. I mean, at one point, doesn't he even say something like, we have laws and we have rules or something? At one point, the commander is actually kind of quoting to Morbius about, like, basically, like, there is a primitive side to man, but we have rules to sort of, to keep that in check. And another thing I thought was really interesting as well is he's advocating that they take the technology of the Krell and the science and the advanced knowledge of the Krell, and they take it back to the United Planet Force, which sounds a lot like the Federation. So I'm sorry.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah.
And the scientific discovery should be shared by everyone. And Morbius wants to keep it all to himself because he doesn't trust humanity, or because he's proud, or he wants the power. So there is this element of like hubristic sort of pride and impulse that's going to lead to your downfall. I thought that was really interesting. Speaking about the first episode of the original series, not The Cage, but Where No Man Has Gone Before, one of the things I thought was interesting was that you said that kind of was slightly more successful than The Cage. One of the things I thought that maybe it was more successful was because the hero, Captain Kirk, the captain, actually gets to have some sort of action. So he does actually get to have a scene on the planet where he's shooting somebody or fighting somebody. And in The Cage, Captain Pike doesn't actually really physically do much, except I suppose in that one scene, he's in the sort of mirage with the castle. He's fighting somebody there, isn't he? And I think that people, maybe back in the 60s, what they wanted from their sci-fi was intelligence, but they also wanted brawn and action and excitement as well. And perhaps maybe there wasn't enough brawn and, sort of physical action from The Cage as they would have liked. And
it's not just the action. I mean, yes, there's a fight, but there's also what you immediately notice watching Where No Man Has Gone Before with William Shatner is it opens in a very different way. It opens with this kind of banter between Kirk and Spock, which of course is going to become such a key part of the success of Star Trek going forward, is this kind of this friendly relationship, but with this kind of tension in it where they're kind of winding each other up. They're quite competitive with each other. And it also sets up, that Gary Mitchell is a kind of old friend of his. He's got kind of personal relationships. Kirk is a very different captain from Pike, I think. Certainly, on the basis of those original series episodes. And this is one of the things that I'm kind of interested in Pike as a character, kind of going, when he's been sort of reinvented in the Kelvin timeline and now, going into Discovery, because I think Pike was much more like the character of the captain in Forbidden Planet, who's a bit sort of grumpy. He's a bit sort of, he's not really charming. Do you know what I mean? He doesn't have that kind of, Captain Kirk has that kind of easy charm. He's got that kind of immediate sort of humanity in a sense. And admittedly, we don't meet Pike on his kind of best day. We meet him at a point where he is, as I said, burnt out. He's considering resigning his commission. He's pretty, sort of unhappy with his situation. He's not in a good state, to the extent that the Doctor is, fixing him a whiskey or whatever and trying to, which of course we see exactly in Star Trek Beyond, a kind of echo of that, precisely that scene of the Doctor kind of fixing him a stiff drink and trying to find out, why is it that he's thinking of quitting his job, or why is it that he's, feeling burnt out, or kind of what's the point of it all, or whatever. But at the same time, we do get a sort of sense of his personality. He's quite kind of tough. He's quite sort of assertive. He's more sort of militaristic, I would say, than Kirk in a way. Kirk seems sort of more easygoing. Somehow he's got that kind of easygoing charm. And Pike has this kind of brutal side to him. I mean, as I say, we're seeing him kind of pushed to bits. He's slightly a man on the brink, so maybe he's not always like this, but he's quite threatening. He when he says that he thinks that the weapon that they're just presenting this illusion that the weapon doesn't work. He says, "You want me to test my theory out on your head," in this quite threatening way. He threatens to break a Talosian's neck. All these sort of things you can't really imagine Kirk, certainly TV series Kirk, ever doing. Kirk is always much more kind of easygoing somehow, even when he's facing really difficult situations. And it kind of interests me because I think that, that to me is one big element of why of at least, not to say why the Cage didn't work, because I think Jeffrey Hunter is great. I mean, I think he plays that role really well, and I think it's an interesting story, and it's quite an interesting character. But he's a very different character. He's almost more of a kind of Picard than a Kirk in some ways. A bit more aloof, a bit more standoffish, a bit more kind of formal. But going forward, of course, when you get to the Kelvin timeline and we kind of reinvent Captain Pike again, he's got that sort of military authority and so on, but he's older. I mean, I don't quite understand how, but somehow he's like 20 years older than Kirk now rather than 10 years older than him. So he's able to be this kind of real mentor figure. And then going into Discovery, I think it's quite interesting. And obviously, this episode will drop, I think, shortly before season 2 of Discovery. So we'll be able to find out pretty quickly how Captain Pike is going to be in this season 2. But going off the trailer, he seems like a completely different person. I mean, he seems like someone who, the Cage was clearly just like a really bad week, and he's totally recovered from it because he's got exactly that kind of easy charm, that kind of Captain Kirk kind of charm. He's got what, people sometimes talk about this idea of happy high status. Like, yes, he's the captain, but he's got that kind of easygoing quality with it, which to me is very different from the character that Jeffrey Hunter is playing in The Cage. It almost, to me, sort of seems to miss the point of Captain Pike somehow, or what makes him distinctive in the Star Trek universe, up to before 2009 anyway, that he was this captain who was a very different type of captain. Whereas I feel like every time they bring him back, he becomes almost less distinctive somehow. So I'm curious to see. This is not to say that I'm not looking forward to seeing him in Discovery. I think seems like a very charismatic actor. It seems like it'll be an interesting choice and an interesting story. But I do sort of wonder, is that really Captain Pike that we saw in The Cage and, by extension in the Menagerie? Or is that are we kind of just using the idea of Captain Pike? In the same way as you could say, like in the Kelvin films, we're using the idea of Captain Kirk and he's not really the same Kirk. And I know there are reasons for that, obviously, to do with the timeline and blah-de-blah. But, somehow they're kind of reconceptualizing who that character is. But you tell everyone it's Captain Kirk and they kind of accept, okay, then it's Captain Kirk.
Yeah, so I think that this is an idea of Captain Pike. I think from what the trailers of the second series of Discovery sort of show, of what I'm basically assuming from the trailers, obviously I have to watch the second series in order to know what the character will really be like. It seems like he's quite well respected by his crew or by the people under his command, and he seems like quite a different character, actually. Maybe just as world weary, but yeah, there's a element of anger, like you said, in Jeffrey Hunter's performance, which doesn't seem to be there in the trailers of the second series of Discovery. And I'm not really that worried about that, because I don't really like the Captain Pike of The Cage, and I don't really like the fact that he ends up disfigured in a wheelchair and then ends up living the rest of his life in a mirage with a woman who can adapt to whatever he desires her to be. I mean, it's bit like living with a lie, really. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people would say, well, he's free, he can move, he can do what he wants, but I think it's a terrible ending for the character. And I also hope that in the 24th century, 23rd century, whatever, I hope that they had better care for people who were disabled than to take them to a planet so that they can live out an imaginary life for the rest of their days. So I mean, I'm fine with them changing the character. I think that the crew in The Cage didn't seem as keen in following Pike's orders or ignoring the fact that they disagreed with what Pike had basically stated. Like right in the beginning of the episode, he says he doesn't want to go rescue these potential survivors on this planet. And everybody kind of looks at him, and then he leaves and everyone kind of looks at each other. And it's obviously clear from their silence that they don't agree with what he's decided to do. And I felt very much like Kirk's crew, they may not have always agreed with what he decided to do, but they loved him. He's he's clearly loved by the entire crew of the Enterprise. And not just because, he's a handsome, roguish, a hero, but because he's a good captain and he cares about them, and he wants to, he's proud of them, and, he wants to make the most of their 5-year mission. And, he also listens to their opinions. He listens to the different opinions of the actual crew. And what we get in the cage instead is Spock and Number One listening to other people's opinions in the briefing room, and actually not really listening to each other much, but kind of just barking at each other. But they do, I guess Number One does listen to what other people have to say. And what we get is Captain Pike sort of gallivanting away, on the planet or being tortured on the planet with, this fantasy woman, and then the rest of the crew cohesively working together to save him. And I'm sort of wondering why. Obviously it'd be a mutiny if they didn't try to save him. But there's that one a sort of helmsman that seems really, really loyal to him. But the rest of the crew don't seem to care that much. I guess maybe the yeoman's attracted to him, like you were saying, the young female yeoman. But other than that, and I guess, okay, maybe the doc. Even the Doctor doesn't seem that fond of him.
I suppose, yeah, the Doctor we're sort of given to understand they have a kind of relationship, they have a kind of friendship, which obviously we'll see again with, with Kirk and McCoy, that kind of, Captain Doctor relationship. But I think it's true, like, he doesn't have Kirk's kind of warmth. He's quite a sort of brusque character, even when he's not. And like I say, it's hard to know because the cage, it does tell us quite explicitly that he's gone through a really rough time. He's we're probably not seeing him at his best somehow. But at the same time, that is, and you could say that's an interesting way to introduce a character. That's a surprising way to introduce a character. Although I guess you could say we see it again with Sisko in Deep Space Nine. He starts off Deep Space Nine not wanting the job, really kind of, and Kirk again in Beyond, that same kind of thing. Do I really want this job? Do I want to quit or whatever? And then kind of getting his mojo back almost. But I don't feel that by the end of the cage, Pike has really got anything back. I mean, he's maybe in a slightly better state than he was going into it, but even at the very end, the final line, he says, engage. He doesn't say it with the kind of confident charisma of Captain Picard. He says it in this kind of slightly offhand. He's a slightly kind of brusque, kind of offhand boss. You kind of don't get the impression that he knows anything about his crew's, what are their wives or their husbands' names, or what are their kids' names, or do you know what I mean? That's why I say he feels a bit more kind of Picard than Kirk in some ways. He feels a bit more sort of detached. Whereas in that trailer for Discovery, the line that jumped out at me was he has this line where he says, why don't we try and have some fun along the way? Basically, yeah, we've got serious work to do, but let's make the most of it. And that just seems like such a different personality somehow to this guy that we saw in the cage. But maybe that'll be a good thing. And with Number One as well, I sort of wonder, because very much she, as we were saying, was sort of playing into this kind of cliche of this kind of cool, slightly aloof, very cool and professional character. I wonder whether she's going to be sort of softened a bit as we kind of get to know her and spend a lot more time with her. And it'll be interesting because we're going to spend more time with these two, quite iconic characters than we ever have before, other than, for people who read the novels or whatever, maybe they've got more insights into them that way. But I mean, Discovery will really get to kind of define those characters to some extent, and they can, who knows where they'll go with it, but they can fill in more backstory. They can fill in more both of what's happened to them since the story of, since the time period of the cage, and also sort of who they were before that, and sort of it will give us a new context for that episode and for who those people were in that episode. Maybe, we've seen Spock smiling. Maybe we're going to find out some, explanation for why Spock in that episode and in When No Man Has Gone Before, like early Spock seems so different. He's kind of, he's much more emotional. There's that great scene where he sees those kind of weird blue flowers and he sort of seems delighted by them, basically. Maybe Discovery's going to try and do a bit of kind of retconning and sort of fit the cage better into sort of established canon and chronology and so on. Who knows? But it'd be interesting to see how much of how those characters are kind of reinvented and what it means to bring them back. I mean, are you only bringing Captain? You see, I sort of assumed when we got to the end of season 1 of Discovery, they wanted that big reveal of it's the Enterprise, because that was a kind of big thing that they were excited about doing, and therefore it has to be Kirk because it's, you know, it wouldn't. It has to be Pike because it wouldn't have been Kirk yet. It surprised me when we found out more about season 2 that actually, yeah, that we're going to meet Captain Pike. That's going to be a big thing. That they're actually interested in the character of Pike. I sort of assumed they just wanted to see the Enterprise, and it's kind of like, well, if you've got the Enterprise in that time period, you've got to have Captain Pike. But it seems like this is something that they have decided to kind of dig into, to kind of, you know, really investigate this character a bit more. And it'll be interesting to see where they go with that.
I mean, surely it'll be the character, not the actual Enterprise itself, right? Because it's still Discovery, the show. So I was thinking that he probably is going to end up commanding the Discovery at some point, somehow, through some twist of storyline. I think the thing is that the whole thing with Spock is obviously they're probably going to address that in the second series of Discovery, but I think we're supposed to think that he hasn't developed the level of Vulcan control that he develops later on, or repression of his emotions or whatever. But one of the things that confuses me is, so this Discovery is supposed to be like 10 years before the original series. So I assume that Kirk is supposed to be still at the Academy, I guess. I don't know. Oh no, or is he serving? He's serving as a junior officer on some other ship somewhere.
Yeah, I think he was he like a weapons officer or something. I can't remember what Kirk's sort of backstory was, but yeah, he'd be like a lieutenant somewhere, I think. Probably, wouldn't he?
On some other ship.
Around this kind of time, yeah. I think so.
And, okay, all right, because I'm just kind of confused. It's like, I was confused about how old Spock was, because I know obviously like Vulcans live longer than human beings, but I was sort of thinking, well, he's already serving, or he's already on in Starfleet, or he's already progressed through Starfleet, unless he's a cadet. I don't know. And I was sort of thinking, how does this translate with Kirk, and how old everybody's supposed to be once the original series starts? Because they're not exactly clear how far into the 5-year journey they are in Where No Man Has Gone Before, are they?
That's a good point. I don't know. I mean, because people always tend to sort of assume that the 5-year mission, because I suppose it probably would, you know, say Star Trek had run for 5 seasons, that maybe that would have been a 5-year mission. People sort of tend to assume that we see the first 3 years of it, I think, and that then there were another 2 years, you know, after Turnabout Intruder that we never got to see, kind of thing. Or I suppose we got to see some of it in the animated series, maybe. But I don't think there's ever any explicit sense of how recently that mission has started, or how recently Kirk has taken command. Do you know what I mean? But definitely in the Menagerie, he sort of talks about how he sort of relieved Captain Pike of the Enterprise in a sense, you know, and Spock was clearly there. Spock was there throughout, basically, so he'd sort of served under 2 captains of that ship. But I guess, you know, from the point of view of Star Trek viewers, of course, you know, we have access to the cage now. For most people watching Star Trek, what they saw was the Menagerie. So they saw, you know, a lot of that footage, but it was framed in a different context, you know, as this kind of, and I'm sure people probably were aware of, you know, because that's quite a weird double episode. They were probably aware of how it came to be like that. It's quite funny watching the episode. They keep drawing attention to this thing of, you know, like, by some mysterious power, we have the ability to watch these visual records, or, you know, we can't quite explain how it is that we have these records. And then in the end, it turns out that basically the Talosians were the ones filming Star Trek back in 1964 and, you know, preserving it for broadcast at the right time. So the Talosians obviously are sort of, you know, allegedly presenting in that context, but I suppose it does read differently if you know, if we know we're watching The Cage as this kind of historical curiosity, as this kind of pilot that for a TV show that was never made. Obviously, we're going to compare it. I mean, in this instance, we're comparing it largely with Forbidden Planet, but the obvious comparison is with Where No Man Has Gone Before, and with the, you know, other early episodes of the original series, because this is kind of almost the Star Trek that we never got, the kind of alternate. This is the kind of parallel universe version of Star Trek, isn't it, in a sense? Whereas for those original viewers, it was very much, it was some weird footage that they got to see in a random episode of Star Trek. And I think, wasn't there a time where Gene Roddenberry was screening The Cage himself? I think maybe in black and white. There was this kind of, you know, when he was doing his kind of lecture circuit or whatever, and then it was again this kind of real curiosity of, you know, let's watch this kind of secret first pilot, which seems weird to me because anyone who's seen The Menagerie has kind of pretty much seen The Cage just chopped into pieces a bit. Do you know what I mean? I don't think there's. I don't even know what you know what there is that you don't get in there, but you get an awful lot of it anyway. But obviously that affects how you see that episode and what you kind of taking out of it. But I guess for us, the comparison is kind of going into, the things that were changed. And I mean, you were talking about Spock. I was kind of thinking, watching it, if you were Gene Roddenberry and you were told, okay, you've got to lose either your girlfriend or Leonard Nimoy, I'm not so sure that watching The Cage, I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't the right decision ultimately to keep Spock, but in that moment, just purely based on that one episode, I actually was watching, I was thinking, I don't know, if I had to pick one of these characters, I think that would be quite a difficult decision. I was kind of curious, what would you, if you just going purely on that one episode, if they said to you, okay, you can either keep the pointy-eared guy who shouts about the circuits or whatever, or you can keep this kind of mysterious character number one, which of them do you think you would have saved from the axe?
Well, I think it depends on whether or not you're going to make an economic decision or not, or whether you're going to make an artistic decision. And I don't know what was going through Gene Roddenberry's mind at the time. I'm sure we probably could read up on it. He probably wrote about it somewhere or was interviewed about it somewhere. But I think Spock is the economic decision, and I think number one is the artistic decision. I think it's much more artistically interesting to have... Well, maybe not artistically interesting, because Spock's pretty artistically interesting. I feel like it makes more of an impact, a social impact, to have a woman on the bridge, somebody like number one, who perhaps isn't necessarily a sex symbol, who is got a position where she's responsible for the crew, and she's responsible for the workings of the ship, and she's in a position of command. I think that would have made much more of an impact, especially in the 60s. However, I think if you make an economic choice, I think you should go with Spock, because I think there's much more appeal for perhaps the audience in the sense that, you have an alien, it's much more otherworldly, you can explore aliens through Spock, you can merchandise him, you could sell fake pointed ears for things. And weirdly, actually, you would think like number one would appeal to female viewers, right? And so if we had this strong female character, that female viewers watching Star Trek would watch it more, would get more excited about it because they were seeing a woman on the bridge. But actually, a big percentage of Spock's fans, especially in the beginning, were women. So a lot of women liked Spock. So, but I don't feel that's like an empowering character for women. I feel that it's more of a sex symbol for women. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think, and that's what they wanted Kirk to be. And I'm not sure that women need more attractive men on television. I think they need more images of other women perhaps maybe that they can identify with, so that they can feel more empowered in their everyday lives to go and do things that perhaps maybe they don't feel confident doing, or are, I would say, maybe written off for them or kept away from them because those ambitions exist in male spheres, or spheres that are traditionally male. So I don't know. People always talk about Uhura being a very empowering female character. I like Uhura. I always have. And I think Nichols does a really great job acting as Uhura, and it's great that she was also African American, but she basically answered the phone. I mean, that's what she did. And she's not number one. And number one could have had much more of an impact, I think. But at the same time, I wouldn't want to give up Spock. I love Spock.
Yeah. It's like, I suppose it's sort of a question, which is the more groundbreaking character? Is it more groundbreaking to have the alien character and the potential for the stories you can do there? Or is it more groundbreaking to have the high-ranking female character? I mean, it's interesting what you were saying about, would women have responded well to number one? I actually wonder, because I don't know, I guess because The Cage was never broadcast originally, I guess you wouldn't necessarily have the reaction beyond like whoever was in the room when they screened it. But I suspect number one is the kind of woman that in that era, a lot of women as well would have issues with and would feel like she was too cool or too kind of frosty or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like she is a kind of, it's a different sort of cliche, and it's I think we can see her as a very strong woman and quite a sort of admirable character. And I'm not saying that wasn't part of how she was being written at the time, but she was also in danger of falling into this kind of trope of, which you see again in Where No Man Has Gone Before. There's this whole story about the character of Elizabeth Dana. Is that her name? The psychiatrist, and this idea of this kind of icy, cool psychiatrist who's kind of penetrating into men's minds and Gary Mitchell, I think, refers to her as a walking freezer unit. There's this kind of, it's another element of kind of misogyny that's going on at play with this, if a woman is kind of not being womanly enough. And I think it's kind of interesting that number one was, not to say that she was nothing more than that trope, or that if the series had developed, that she wouldn't have developed into a more rounded and interesting character. But she was definitely kind of consciously sort of attached to that kind of trope or that kind of type. And it's a type that historically has not been, always popular, certainly with men, but often with women as well, actually.
Yeah, and I think that Spock also has afforded a lot of people he's brought a lot of comfort to a lot of people because of the fact that, he's the outsider, and a lot of people growing up watching Star Trek felt like an outsider in their community or in their family or just in their society. And so watching Spock, is comforting. It makes you feel like that. I mean, like less lonely, that character speaking to you. I'm not sure if you'd get that from the more reserved number one, because Spock was reserved, but there's definitely emotion involved in his character. Like it's all sort of suppressed emotion, but it's there. And he's obviously very emotional towards the captain and McCoy. Like, even though he is restrained in his displays of emotion, that he actually cares about them. And you're right, from number one, you don't really get much at all. We get a mild annoyance, I think, and maybe a certain level of sardonic humor or something. But you don't really feel like she's, brimming with passion underneath. She does seem a little bit flat. And so I'm not sure that would appeal to people who were looking for a character that was a bit different, so that they could identify with that. I think it's a shame that he had to get rid of one of them, why he couldn't keep the two of them. But then on the other way, in the sense, like, it did pave the way for Spock to become this amazing character, and it did also pave the way for an African-American woman to be on the bridge. And I think it's really important that there was an African-American person working on the bridge at that time in the 60s. So in America. So, in a way, I think it did lead to good things. I think that I would question how much number one, or the lack of number one being in the original series, affected further iterations of Star Trek that came afterwards. So the fact that the women on the bridge of the Next Generation Enterprise are not number one like at all, and the women in Deep Space Nine are probably the more empowered versions of Star Trek women that I've seen. Obviously in Discovery we have a completely different situation, but Discovery's being made now, so
T'Pol is probably the closest, I would say, to number one in some ways, because you've got that kind of cool, aloof, and again, with the character of T'Pol, there is a kind of misogyny, not necessarily, from the viewer, but even. And obviously, in the case of T'Pol, you've got this kind of double whammy, because there's a kind of racial element with this anti-Vulcan sentiment. But at the same time, the way often that, say, someone like Trip or even Archer in like early episodes of Enterprise relates to T'Pol very much plays into that idea of the kind of, this kind of cool, frigid woman who's come in with her sort of... Do you know what I mean? You could almost be like... What's that film with Sigourney Weaver as the kind of... mean boss. Do you know what I mean?
Do you mean The Devil Wears Prada? No,
I mean
that's Glenn Close, isn't it? No, that's Meryl Streep. Oh my god, I get them all confused. That's awful as well.
But I'm thinking of that kind of like sort of 1980s, like the kind of power woman coming in and like, I think you might be right. Yeah, Working Girl with Melanie Griffith. Anyway, yes, exactly.
Who plays the complete opposite.
Exactly, who's the kind of nice, warm kind of ditzy or whatever, and Sigourney Weaver is the kind of tough, bitch, basically. And that's the kind of cliche. And I suppose T'Pol's character, I think, does slightly play into that. And the challenge, I suppose, Deep Space Nine obviously found great ways of writing the female characters and kind of slightly subverting those stereotypes. Although, when we were talking to Nana Visitor, she was saying how, there were people who really didn't like Kira because they thought she was too tough and she was too kind of assertive and not everyone kind of responded to that. But I think it's a really interesting point that you make, that when we get to TNG, the female characters have become very much in this kind of nurturing It is almost like a step backwards, isn't it? Because, I mean, okay, you've got Tasha Yar, who's the security chief, but other than that, and unfortunately, because she doesn't stick around, it kind of skews it. But, you know, you've got Deanna Troi and Beverly Crusher, who are not just, as people always say, in the nurturing kind of medical roles, but they're also, as characters, they're both very kind of warm, very kind of kind. Not that these are bad qualities, but they're very kind of traditionally sort of feminine qualities, I suppose, in a way. They're not really, until you get quite late into Next Gen, you see Deanna kind of looking into the, you know, command possibilities a bit more and doing that training and so on. But, you know, they're very focused on the kind of softer, kind of warmer, kinder side. But I think it's interesting. I mean, this idea of number one as this kind of cool, detached, cerebral character. I mean, we keep coming back to this idea of, you know, as we know, the Cage was rejected for being too cerebral. You know, what is the balance? And Star Trek, you know, one of the reasons that we love Star Trek is it's always balance the kind of the social commentary, the ideas, the kind of interesting, the sort of intellectual side of science fiction to some extent, with real kind of lovable characters, with great relationships, with great humour and so on. And I mean, we started off talking about all the ways in which Star Trek borrowed from Forbidden Planet, certainly going back to the Cage. And I mean, I feel like we maybe undersold the level of, if you just watch those two things side by side, just visually. I mean, there's a scene early on, for example, where the crew step into these, I think they're like sort of stasis pods or something, but it literally, for a moment, you think, oh, they're going to beam down, because it looks like they've walked onto a transporter set out of the original series, and they all stand upright on these kind of lights above and below them, and they kind of glow for a bit, and then they get out again. I mean, there's even just things like the design of the doors on the Enterprise. They've got these kind of angular doors, which you see all over Forbidden Planet. The language is, just as we see in Star Trek, is very nautical. They call the captain a skipper. They have a bosun. Even the kind of colour palette, you know, that kind of muted colour palette that you see in the Cage, which obviously changes once Star Trek kind of gets going properly, is very much the same sort of colour palette as Forbidden Planet. So there's a lot that they have in common. But in some ways, maybe we should be looking at what is it that Star Trek does differently? How does it differentiate itself? And to me, it's, you know, the big shift, I would say almost immediately when you get to When No Man Has Gone Before, is, say, as I mentioned, this banter between Kirk and Spock, this kind of character, focus on character, focus on these people as people with kind of vibrant lives. There's scope for bickering, there's scope for kind of winding each other up, there's scope for all this kind of everyday human stuff that is not the kind of sci-fi humans in space kind of advanced people or whatever. There's scope for much more warmth, much more humour, much more kind of humanity in a sense. And maybe that's one of the things that kind of gradually shifts in some ways. And one of the reasons that the Cage does feel slightly strange going back to it now, it's not for me so much that it's really cerebral, that it's all just people talking. I mean, you can kind of make that argument. I suppose you're right that Captain Pike doesn't get that much action in that episode, but actually there is quite a lot of action of various kinds. And if you're looking at it purely as a piece of entertainment, you know, they've thrown in a fight with a kind of a guy in a sort of with, you know, swords and stuff. They've thrown in castles. They've thrown in these ridiculous, you know, Captain Pike's sort of purple outfit. They've thrown in this sexy green lady dancing. They've kind of thrown all this stuff at the screen to make it seem like, look at this TV show, it's going to be exciting, it's going to do this, it can do that, it can do everything. You know, you can sort of imagine Gene Roddenberry kind of hurling all this stuff into the episode somehow. But really, maybe what it doesn't quite have is that kind of those kind of easy relationships between the characters and that kind of family feel, which is such a big part of Star Trek's appeal. And maybe really we do owe so much of that to William Shatner, because he's the one who comes in and his style is so different to Jeffrey Hunter. I mean, they're both quite old-fashioned in a sense. You know, people laugh about William Shatner's delivery and his slightly kind of over-the-top style and quite mannered style. But at the same time, they're both quite kind of old school Hollywood in some ways, but in such a different way. You know, they've got such a different kind of sort of feel to them as people, I think. And that really in some ways sets the tone for the show and really is one reason there's such a big shift in this sort of almost slightly hard to define kind of tonal way between those two pilot episodes. And really that's what Star Trek takes going forward. And that's kind of a big part of what makes Star Trek work going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen both William Shatner and Jeffrey Hunter act in other things other than Star Trek. And I would say that although they obviously were playing different roles than each other, I would say that it's a similar thing in both those cases. And the Searchers, I saw, I've seen the Searchers, and Jeffrey Hunter is in the Searchers, which is a Western, and then the brothers Karamazov, I hope I've said that right, the film adaptation of that with Yul Brynner. William Shatner's in that, quite a young William Shatner, and in both cases their performances also reflect the same thing as we see in Star Trek. William Shatner is a very warm performer. I feel that when he smiles, you really don't feel like he's kind of acting a smile. He's really genuinely smiling. He's just a much more emotional actor, and it's kind of like, it seems kind of almost like a sort of tenderness to him. And in The Searchers, Jeffrey Hunter doesn't do a bad job. He does a very good job in the role that he's in, but it's not a warm portrayal, it's not a warm performance, and he's much more muted. And I feel like that in a way with Spock, it's easier for the character of Spock, Leonard Nimoy, to play off another character who is a much more warm, emotionally extrovert character than, say, for instance, somebody like Pike, who seems to be more reserved and more emotionally closed off. And so in a way, I think that the show wouldn't have been as big a success without the duo of William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy in the roles that they were in. It's the actors playing off each other. I mean, one of the things that they always talk about when they talk about success of TV shows, and this goes for lots of successful TV shows, not just Star Trek, is the chemistry between the actors. Now, granted, I think you need good actors in order to do that. So you need people who are going to be good actors in their own right by themselves. But if those actors can work together and they can find something in each other's performances, and there's the chemistry between them, I don't necessarily mean like romantic chemistry. I mean chemistry as in like they seem like good friends, or chemistry as in they seem like deadly enemies. If the actors are excited about what they're doing and they're good at playing off each other and the dynamic works, then I think you've got a magic there that is gonna be successful in any show. I mean, and obviously the script has to be good. Production values have to be good, the directors have to be good. But if the actors have good chemistry, then I feel like the whole production kind of falls in line with that, because then the writers like writing the dialogue for these characters. So they really put their heart and soul into the script, and then the directors are excited. So they try to direct as well as they can, or they work with the actors to come up with a better scene or a better performance. And I feel like the whole crew can see that, and so they try to work to the actor's strengths. So I don't like constantly talking about actors on podcasts. I like talking about them sometimes, but I also think it's important to recognize all the other people that are involved in making a television show or a film. There's copious amounts of people who are involved, not just the people in front of the screen, and a huge amount of work goes into writing a story, a script. A huge amount of work goes into providing like the production values, like the scenery and the costumes and all that sort of stuff. So I don't always like talking about the actors all the time, because I feel they are an essential component of the show, but not necessarily the only component. But in the case of Star Trek, the actors really made it. I don't think the original series, I don't think Star Trek would exist today if it hadn't been for William Shatner, DeForest Kelley, and also Leonard Nimoy's performances. I think those three actors in that triumvirate, whatever you call it, sort of three-man band, without them, I don't think we'd have Discovery.
Definitely. And I think it's interesting, actually. I mean, even watching When No Man Has Gone Before, you miss DeForest Kelley, because he's not even in it by that point, and Nichelle Nichols actually, but at the same time you have got that dynamic between Kirk and Spock. And I mean, it's an interesting point you make. I mean, we don't tend to talk probably all that much compared to a lot of other Star Trek podcasts. We probably don't talk that much about the actors on Primitive Culture, because we're kind of more interested in like where the ideas come from, what are the kind of real world parallels and so on. But at the same time, I think it is legitimate. I mean, we're looking at what are the different influences that make this kind of piece of art or this piece of culture what it is. And obviously the actors and their own acting backgrounds and their own styles and all of that kind of feeds into it massively. And I think you're absolutely right that it's not so much that William Shatner is, a better actor than Jeffrey Hunter or whatever, but maybe it is more about the chemistry. And maybe part of it, though, is the way that the cage is constructed. Captain Pike's relationship for so much of that episode is with Vina, who's the kind of, I mean, maybe it's silly to talk about her as the guest star because it's not a series by that point, but at the same time we don't actually see all that much of him interacting with his own crew, except towards the end, these awkward scenes between him and Number One and between him and the yeoman, where there's this kind of the women have been brought down and there's this kind of slight awkwardness around it, but at the same time we don't really see the kind of all that much of the sort of everyday interactions between him and the crew. We actually see more of Spock and Number One interacting with each other in a sense, because they're the ones trying to sort things out. And in that, actually, it did remind me a bit of Discovery, especially like the first couple of episodes of Discovery, the kind of preamble episodes, where you had Captain Giorgio, and then you had Saru and Michael Burnham, and they were the two subordinates and kind of almost at each other. Like the relationship was between the two of them. I mean, I know Burnham has a relationship with Giorgio, and that's very important. But at the same time, the kind of, well, that's sort of trying to recapture the kind of bickering and the kind of humour and the kind of humanity of those relationships in the original series. It's very much between those two characters, and the captain is kind of a bit above all of that somehow, a bit separate from it, can kind of look, she can look on it and comment on it, but she's not kind of getting involved in it in the same way. But I think you're absolutely right that, it's Nimoy and Shatner that you get, in that first scene of Where No Man Has Gone Before, those actors sell that relationship, and that maybe Shatner is very good at coming in, and this is his just a kind of one-off shot at this character or whatever, but selling those relationships with other people. And ironically, for an actor who, some people found quite difficult to work with for various reasons, but at the same time, what you get on screen is he's someone who conveys not just great personal charm, but great relationships with other people, a great kind of connection with other people. Whereas maybe what you get from Captain Pike is a character who seems a little bit more self-contained and a bit more sort of in his own, doing his own thing somehow. Do you know what I mean? He's more the kind of the captain who's his own person, and everyone else just sort of works for him. Whereas Kirk is definitely the guy who, has the kind of personal relationships with everyone. Sometimes
a sign of a good actor is somebody who is a perfectly pleasant person that everybody likes, but he's always playing a horrific villain. And that, I mean, DeForest Kelley, before he started at Star Trek, was always playing the villain in Western films. And by all accounts, he was one of the nicest members of the cast, because he was a lovely person to get along with and apparently very pleasant. So I sometimes think, and I mean, I won't go into naming all my favourite actors, but there are actors today that I have seen playing roles that are absolutely horrendous. They are horrible, horrible, horrible characters. But then when you see them interviewed, they talk about acting that person. And I think, oh my God, it's not even the same. I mean, not even similar. Like, they're playing, I don't know, some like murdering Nazis or something. And then, they're actually really nice people. I mean, a prime example of this is Casablanca. Famous film Casablanca, the main Nazi, and it's terrible that I can't remember this actor's name, but the main Nazi in Casablanca, so he's like the head commander, who's a horrible person, horrible character. He was played by a Jewish actor. Or I don't know if he was Jewish, but he was definitely very, very anti the Nazis. And that's one of the reasons why he wanted, I mean, I think he left Germany. He was definitely a German actor, and he left Germany, and, he funded the Allied war efforts and stuff. Oh, he married a Jewish woman. That's it. He wasn't Jewish himself, but he married a Jewish woman, and they had to leave Germany. And he was very, very anti the Nazis. And one of the reasons why he wanted to play Nazi roles is because he wanted to show how horrible they were to the audience, because he wanted people to know. So just goes to show you that, like, somebody can be playing quite a nice character, but actually can be quite a difficult person to work with. And somebody who's a really easy person and a very genial personality can actually be playing a monster. But then that's the sign of a good actor. Actors aren't necessarily supposed to play themselves. I know a lot of actors do. And I suppose they're playing parts of their own psychology, I suppose. You could argue that. But a sign of a good actor is someone who's very changeable, can play lots of different
and maybe the key thing in terms of, the audience experience, and also, looking back, I mean, we're looking back at this episode that is like 52 years old now, isn't it? Really, or more actually in the case of The Cage, because it was made, before the original series debuted, I don't know, maybe getting on for 54 years old or something. I mean, for something that kind of endures for that length of time that Star Trek has, in a way, I mean, it sounds horrible to say it, but the working relationships that people have at the time are not the key thing that's going to last. Do you know what I mean? What's going to last is what gets on screen, and that kind of it's a bit like they always say, don't they? You can tell when people have had too much fun, like making a comedy, or like sometimes when a comedy doesn't work, that it's because actually they were enjoying themselves too much. Do you know what I mean? Then people were having too much fun making it, and therefore, like, the actors got to have the fun and the audience didn't. Whereas sometimes the things that are really funny for an audience are the things that were actually a bit grueling and not particularly enjoyable for the actors, but it was kind of discipline and so on. I always feel like with Insurrection, maybe this is kind of what went wrong there, was that they thought they were doing this romp and all the actors had a great time, hiking around in the mountains and so on, and somehow it didn't quite translate, into the movie theatre maybe. But definitely, I suppose that's a part of it is, we've heard all the stories about the different Star Trek sets, and some of them were, some of them had like serious tensions going on between members of the crew, members of the cast, who didn't get on with each other. Some were a barrel of laughs and having a great time. It's kind of interesting to hear about that process going on behind the scenes, but I don't think it necessarily does affect the end product in the same way, if you know what I mean, that you might expect or whatever. And that is partly a mark of, professionalism. I mean, say with Star Trek Voyager, you had for years this relationship between Captain Janeway and Seven of Nine, which is quite a touching, heartfelt, interesting relationship. And those two actors did not get on at all. But at the same time, they were able to play that individually and to kind of sell that and make that work and make you believe that there was a good relationship between them. Even if, in real life, that was far from the case. And I guess, that is kind of part of the job, isn't it?
Well, I guess actors have to do that when they're supposed to pretend to be in love with each other, aren't they? I always find it weird that actors can portray quite a passionate love affair on screen, but yet both be deeply committed to other people in their own personal lives. But it's acting, isn't it? It's pretend. That's why I'm glad I've never actually dated an actor, because I think I would find it difficult to watch my partner.
Especially if you were married to William Shatner during the run of the original series, that could be a challenge.
Like kissing a new woman every week, right?
Yeah. Well, before we go, Clara, did you have any final thoughts on Forbidden Planet or The Cage or any of these questions that we've been talking about?
Just the last thing that I wanted to say was one of the things I did find interesting was that though Roddenberry claims that he wasn't influenced by Forbidden Planet, I did notice that Robbie, the robot who's in Forbidden Planet, is essentially a walking replicator. Because there is one scene in the film where it is explained that he can replicate human food. And I thought, oh, that's a replicator. And I wondered where Gene Roddenberry had got the replicator idea from, if it was even him, if it wasn't maybe a writer who'd got the idea of a replicator. But I actually remember watching that recently and being like, Robbie the robot is a replicator.
I love Robbie the robot. I kind of feel like, obviously there were robots in the original series and androids and so on, but they were always very kind of human presenting. I don't know. I feel I feel like he would absolutely have fitted in with the original series somehow. There's a kind of camp quality to Robbie the robot. He's sort of slightly ridiculous, but quite lovable and quite, I don't know. It's a great piece of design. Yeah, basically a robot butler. And yeah, it's interesting. It sort of makes you think, in some ways it's surprising there wasn't a bit more of that in Star Trek. They did have it in Lost in Space, I guess, which was running at the same time. There was a robot character in that, I think, wasn't there?
Yeah, I thought it was the same robot, actually. So much so that I actually looked up the robot from Lost in Space, and it's not the same robot. But it's similar
feel. Yeah. There you go. That's the topic for a future podcast. But for now, I think the time has come to bid farewell to these Forbidden Planets, to leave a warning. This subject's not to be returned to on pain of death for me and Clara. But it's been fun talking about Forbidden Planet, talking about The Cage, and talking about how we kind of moved into the rest of Star Trek from there. But that's not all we've been doing this week on Trek FM. So here's a listen to what else you might have missed elsewhere on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Earl Grey. I really hope they made an announcement to evacuate the forward part of the saucer section.
Well, he instructed Troy, and so she would, of course, given the command silently.
Yeah, but there was no time.
Yeah,
it didn't seem like there was much time.
No, there wasn't.
She did it. Don't even question it.
Be prepared to do it, and like 30 seconds later, they were ramming the thing.
Yep, plenty of time.
Okay.
Those people serving on board, they know if they say move, you move immediately.
Literary Treks.
I love that it's not just, Keith DeCandido is playing the long game here, and we get these threads woven through all these stories, and it's not just, dumped on you all at once. It's a really nice, slow, methodical way to tell a story, and I'm loving it.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
He's equating survival with winning. But again, because we know the end, he needs to survive and not die in the war so he can get back to the mirror universe. And I just love seeing that.
Yeah, it's great because if you just see this on the surface and don't know the ending, it's true.
Warp 5.
Problem with Section 31 is it is not an official organization. It is extra legal. It does not answer to any authority. It does not answer to any oversight. Officially, it doesn't exist.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published.
And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place is to join the larger conversation on the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type in Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up.
If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture. That'll come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM.
Primitive Culture is brought to you by Duncan Barrett and Clara Cook. You can find Duncan Barrett on Twitter at Barrett's Books. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC.
If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details.
Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. We really appreciate any support you can give us, and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM.
We'd like to take this opportunity to thank our associate producers here at Primitive Culture, Tony Black and Amy Nelson. Tony was one of the founders of this show, and we still keep him in the loop about what we're doing. You can find him on Twitter at @AJBlackWriter and online hosting about a dozen other podcasts on everything from The X-Files to classic cinema. Amy is the host of 2 shows on the Trek FM network, Earl Grey and The Edge, and you can find her online on Twitter at @Miss Amy Nelson.
You're blended, all right.